Hello and welcome back to the course. We're going to try to explore a little bit more the context of the few weeks ahead. I hope you're getting on fine with the readings and the tasks on Brightspace. We're going to have still a few more interactions, but this is to provide you with a little bit of context of the readings around others, the connection to others, and the reflections around this idea of fate and vocation. So where we are so far is exploring spirituality, relating that to self, and not trying to see what this means when it comes to our relationship with others. Other being other people, as well as the great big other, or nature itself. But if we go back to why are we here, what is life about? There's a sense of consensus that a life well lived is a life with meaning and with purpose. Now we are left to define what the purpose is, and we're left to figure out generally what the meaning is. But the sense is that if we find meaning and if we have a purpose, then life is worth living, life is a good life. Now meaning here sets or is helpful to help create a container, a context and a direction for our actions, our contemplations, the way we learn, what we learn, and the experiences that we undertake. On the different side, meaning also helps us deal with the inevitability of death, and that helps shape the rituals of this transition. And in one of the chapters that you have to read by Robert Solomon, this is what we talked about and we explore. Now, of course, the question remains, do we uncover meaning as life goes on, or do we make meaning? So is it somehow a rational action to try to figure out what meaning is, and we almost try to reassure ourselves because, well, if I can somehow come up with some meaning for my life, then it's okay, or I can cope with anxiety. Or do we uncover meaning in that there is something, there's a trend, there's a trajectory, and we just have to figure out what the cues are in our environment to make sense of the meaning and to find the guidance to move forward, which of course is a much more optimistic, hopeful scenario. And that's what fate comes in. Fate or fatalism, which is not quite the same thing. And then where are we with our free will in the midst of this scenario? So for Solomon, spirituality is fatalism and activism together, and neither without the other. So it's not, I just follow fate and I have no say in my destiny, in my life. Neither is it, I control my life from start to end. We cannot control everything. We are not in charge of the circumstances. We're not in charge of the parents that we're born into, the family, the time, the place, but we are in charge of what we do with the circumstances we are dealt with. And that's the idea of Solomon. Our lives and fortunes are to a large extent the products not only of our own character, but of the more embracing character of the culture and the times we live in. And that places our sense of responsibility on a different plane. We are always responsible, but also there are elements where we just have to allow chance, fate, something else to take over, because we are not completely responsible for everything. And it's a paradox that we need to hold in consciousness again, and that's what makes the value of spiritual exploration, because we need to somehow accommodate our reality with that paradox, that at the same time I'm responsible for pretty much all that I am and all that I do, but there are so many things that are outside of my control, and I need to accept that as well. And there's no responsibility to ascribe to that aspect of my life and myself. Solomon discusses this idea of fate as perhaps just how we develop character. And that's a useful way to explore the idea of fate as being something we just cannot control. So we are the product of circumstances beyond our control and the result of our conscious choices. And our character, therefore our fate, unfolds over time. And when it comes to meaning, we just therefore understand meaning as looking back and then realizing, oh, that's why these things happen. And we all tend to do that. That's how sometimes we think, oh, that's why it made sense that I chose this university and not this one. Or that's why I met this person and not that one, because otherwise where I am now would not have happened. We also think of that on the negative side, as in, if only I had not been there or not met that person or not made that decision, I would be in a better position. But who knows? Perhaps that's the path that we were supposed to take. And that's when we lurch towards fatalism. And we had to be there. We had to go through that experience. But it's important to allow a space for unexpected happenings, luck, chance. And the fact that we choose how we respond to those opportunities that present themselves that we don't control. So fate sets the tone for a meaningful narrative for our lived existence, with or without the little nuggets of luck sprinkled over. That would be the way, one way to look at life. Now, I mentioned very briefly before this idea of daemon, and I just want to return to it because James Hillman, the depth psychologist, talks about daemon as fate. More precisely, he says that the daemon is the key to the unfolding of our life's meaning. And our life meanings unfold by necessity, and with a capital N. It's not something we can fight with. Things happen because they need to happen. That's basically the idea. And he works on what he calls the acorn theory. So we are all born like an acorn with the potential of the oak tree we're going to become. There's everything in it. But of course, depending where the acorn is and grows, the circumstances, the life context, the family, the culture, everything, the oak tree is going to grow into a slightly different shape. And it's going to have to adapt to its environment, whether there's a lot of sun or a lot of water, a lot of other trees around, or whether it's a big, spacious forest that it's in. So in the same way as individuals, we've dealt with potential. We've dealt with the potential of everything that we can be, but there are circumstances that also shape how we get to be who we are and how we get to unfold our potential. So the daemon is the one who remembers what kind of tree we ultimately can become and perhaps are meant to become, because it plays a bigger role on a different scale. So the daemon has the prescience of the general orientation of our life from birth. It retains consciousness of what and how we could be, whereas our human self, as baby, forgets. And we just have to work it out by living. Oh, what was it that I was good at? Where were my talents? Where do I need to send my energy towards? So for Hillman, life is foreordained, but not foretold. So there is still a shaping that we take part in, but there is also a greater narrative that we just uncover as life happens by necessity. Of course, sometimes we completely miss the cues as to where our talents reside, or that it would be actually quite a good idea for us to explore the right path rather than the left. And that may be because we're so caught up in our own drama or own ego desires that we're going to miss the invitations. We're not going to follow through with an opportunity or a new invitation to explore something different because it's too challenging. And sometimes also we feel that the talent, the desire, the hunger is there, but our family or institutions make it very difficult for us to follow that path. And that's how you have sometimes people who could have been very talented, who fail to achieve their potential, and that's how we judge them, which, is not particularly right, but because they did not have the right opportunities to get to that. So the oak tree stays small as opposed to becoming all that it could be because of circumstances. But at the end of the day, for Hillman, there's no mediocre daemon. And in the same way, there's no mediocre life. Life is always meaningful and important as long as you really live through that path the best you can. So it's becoming really aware that there is something unfolding. The reason why we're here, it's because there's meaning and it matters. How we perform with the hand that we've been dealt is what matters. It's the way we do things, it's the way we live life that also helps shape meaning. And for the many called to keep the light under a bushel, to be in service to the middle way, to join the rank and file, many of us fall into that. Not everybody is a great leader. Not everybody is going to change the world in such a drastic way that we're going to have libraries or public buildings, named after us. Of course, that's the dream of many, but it's not the point. The point is to be able to somehow live life truthfully, authentically, according to your daemon, your calling, fate, serve it well, be present, and find harmony in that. And that matters. That matters even if nobody really remembers the impact that you've had. And in this idea of transformative leadership, you can really connect this sense of service, the sense of presence, the sense of connection with something greater beyond the small self, ego, desires. And that's what Hillman mentions when it says it's not really personal. The daemon, fate, is not just personal. It's also a collective unfolding. And that we can never be sure what the full story is when it comes to humanity or human history. But what we can just assume is that the reason why I'm here at this time in this place, and the reason why I have this path to follow and to engage with, it's perhaps because it means something also on a bigger scale. Not even just for my family, the people I get to know, not even just for my culture, but perhaps on a much, much, much broader, longer scale, grander scale. Perhaps on a cosmic level, it means something. And that's where gratitude comes in. Perhaps the best way to serve the daemon, the best way to somehow live life and engage with it in the way that makes it meaningful, is to be able to accept that life is just what it is. And we're going to get also to death being just what it is. It's not something greater than it is. It just is what it is. So a belief and acceptance of fate has to do with embracing a larger narrative in which our actions and our fortunes have meaning and make sense in our lives. And part of that meaning and making sense is our willingness to feel and show our gratitude. Gratitude for the things that I can consciously engage with, and gratitude for the things that I cannot even understand and explain, but are there. And all of that is the way I make sense of my life and make sense of myself. And that's where God has played such a big role. Or you can call it also anima mundi, that's the soul of the world. It's helpful to somehow personify, for us conscious beings, personify this idea of, the great narrator of our life, or the person who ordains the cosmos. It doesn't really matter if we have a formal answer or a specific picture. What matters is that we're able to be in relationship with something transcendent. I just had this quote from a study that I made on moral exemplars, and I looked in terms of field studies. I explored a range of spiritual healers, and they were very interesting people to explore, because I was interested in how their beliefs, and a lot of them, of course, have some form of transcendental belief in what they articulate, but how did that translate when it came to their own moral human responsibility? How do I live my life in the here and now when I also have a sense of a vocation, a calling, something bigger, and playing with fate, somehow trying to not change it, but at least understand the little tricks, the little cues that are presented to us, and serving others to help them find their meaning and unfold their own fate. And what's interesting is that even when we admire people like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, and you had readings about that, there's something a little bit scary about those people, because we like to say they're extraordinary. How many of us really could face taking over that mission, that calling? How many of us really are ready to go through all of that path and trajectory to get to a stage when we say, yes, I've made a difference? How did they handle their own doubts as well? Because it was not a straightforward path. And we like to portray them as heroics. We like to think of them as people who had no doubt, who had no weaknesses. And it's easier to deal with it like that, because they are exceptional people. They're not like us. They are not dealing with the corruption of our own doubts and fears and anxieties. They're not thinking of their families if they just follow their calling. But actually, they were very human. They had doubts. They experienced a lot of fears and a lot of struggle with not being caught in that complex of a hero, of sacrificing themselves for something bigger and finding in that a transcendent meaning. So it's a very difficult balance when it comes to figuring out how do I locate myself, flawed human being, in light of fate, calling, perhaps it's going to push me in a direction that I may not really want to go because it's asking of me too much. And what's interesting when we explore a whole range of moral exemplars or good leaders, people who have really made a difference. And by that, I mean that can be the little activists, environmental activists defending indigenous rights or defending the environment, women's rights defenders in cities or countries where human rights and women's rights in particular are a real issue. So they fear for their lives. And yet they say, I just had to do it. I could do something. I had to try. And I could not act. So sometimes it's almost in spite of myself, in spite of my fears, in spite of my human feelings, that I have to do something. And that would be the daemon. That would be the calling, the vocation, and fate. You could see it like that. Because the more I resist, the more difficult my life becomes. Because it's a choice. I'm aware of the choice that I make not to go down that route, even though there's something there. There's hunger. There's something that needs to be expressed. And what is interesting here when it comes to spirituality, to bring it back to our human body, we're part of this material world, is that our responsibility is also coming from our guts. The gut reaction, the sense that, yeah, wait a minute, something is wrong here, and I need to act upon that. So the whole being, not just the mind, not just the spirit, but also the body, needs to be involved in our enactment. And it's always interesting and quite harrowing to look at the experience of people who have survived really inhuman conditions. And I've put here just a couple of parallel profiles of Viktor Frankl and Primo Levi, who both survived concentration camps. And they are very different individuals to start with. But what's interesting is in the way they wrote their experience, about their experiences afterwards, they had very different ways of trying to make sense of what had happened to them. And for Viktor Frankl, who developed logotherapy, and I think I mentioned it before, which is the quest for meaning in order to cope with life's difficulties and suffering, for him, what he saw in the camps was that even in abject circumstances, there were a few, only a few, but it matters, few people who kept in themselves some freedom, a vestige of spiritual freedom, independence of mind that could not be taken away. And they would be those men who would walk through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They had a choice not to do it, but they wanted to do it. And nothing could take that part of humanity away from them. There was a choice. Choosing your attitude in any given circumstances, even when the most harrowing context wants to just demean you to below the level of humanity. Primo Levi had a much more difficult time trying to contextualize his experience and finding meaning in that suffering. To him, it was meaningless suffering. And a lot of people agree with that in terms of the way the system of dehumanization was approached. It was meaningless. It was just taking away everything that matters morally, socially, humanly. And part of the reason why perhaps he committed suicide at the end of his life is that despite for him the duty to testify perhaps on behalf of those who could not testify, there was no transcendent meaning that he could find. Whereas Frankl was able to somehow find some meaning And to him, the meaning is, at least I have to be responsible for the life that I have. It may not be the one that I would have liked, but somehow fate was put in that way, and I was put attached to that fate, to that daemon, and there's something that I need to live. And I need to live for the realization that I'm responsible for that gift. So there's lots of questions that come from these contrasting experiences. Where does the call come from when life seems indeed hopeless? How do we keep that going when suffering is unbearable, when the choices are indeed very limited, or when fate seems inescapable, and when gratitude seems impossible? How do we handle that difficulty? How do we face the suffering? How do we remain human and spiritual? And one of the answers is perhaps that we just have to find in ourselves the courage to face our life as finite. Life is attached to death somehow, somewhere, and we don't choose the way we're going to die, but it's going to be there. So that certainty is something we can work with. That's back to free choice, conscious engagement. Parker Palmer suggests that those people who took the courageous step to stand for what they believe, and he quotes in particular the life of Rosa Parks. And sometimes it's just a sudden awakening. Sometimes it's from early on, from childhood, I have a strong commitment and this is what I want to commit my life to. So it really depends. But they know that they will be punished for it, and yet they come to understand that no punishment anyone or anything, any system might inflict on them could possibly be worse than the punishment they inflict on themselves for conspiring in their own diminishment. If I cannot somehow serve what I feel is my truth, deep down, not just social rules, but my own truth, then life is not worth living. And again, that's where fate can come as a comforting sense of direction. Somehow, at some point, I need to let go of wanting to prove and be sure. I just need to follow through what seems to be the path. And I don't really know where it's going to lead me, but I have to have faith that this is where I need to go. Because life without that is not worth living. And what I found in the study that I did was that for quite a few of those spiritual healers, the striking aspects of their commitment was a wise acceptance of life as transitory and precious. Because it is finite, it is precious. And our knowledge of life finishing at some point, and we have no control of it, is actually what enables us to celebrate life as it is right now, is what enables us to be in the moment, and is what enables us to create something beautiful out of the gift that we have, out of the talent. So rather than go into the despair of death, which some of the philosophical existentialists would go towards, life is horrible because it is pointless, meaningless, since we're all going to die. Here, the approach is to say, well, because we know that I'm going to die, that's when life is precious. That's when life can be met with love. That's when life must be met without fear, without anxieties, with just an acceptance of my humanity fully, beautifully developed. So death is not the problem. When we take that perspective, the denial of death makes life more unbearable and anxiety-inducing than an acceptance of death as part of our lived experience. And that's where rituals, which spirituality and religion, used to be very good at providing us with, rituals and a conscious narrative help contextualize the experience. We need to make sense of the passage from life to death for ourselves as well as for others. And often we're much more concerned about how others are going to feel after we're dead, not because they're going to miss my grandiosity and my amazingness, but because we might feel that they're going to miss us or we're not going to be there for them when they need something that we could provide. So it's actually quite compassionate thought to try to ritualize death so that there's a meaning to that experience that is inevitable. When death becomes the object of sublimation, fantasy, or thrill, it becomes either a glorious moment or a pathetic moment. And what Solomon says is, just remember death is just death. And it's probably the healthiest attitude that we can have. So I just want to leave you with a few ponderings, and especially for one of the tasks, which is going to be around the reflection on the passage of death around All Saints' Day. When we're in life and in death, what is my responsibility to myself? And what is my responsibility to others? The other, capital O, or others. How do I define my responsibility? When I know that I'm living in the here and now, when I know that I am just a transient being who also is going to return to, I don't know, fill in the blanks. When it comes to meaning, when do we find meaning and how do we find meaning in our life? And we've established it's important. It's something individually that matters, collectively that matters. But when and how do we find it? And if I don't find my meaning, because that creates another anxiety, is my life then worthless? Is my life meaningless? Probably not. But how would you approach that? And thinking of leadership, a great deal of the task of the leader is to give a sense of direction and meaning and contextualization. So how would you handle people who come and say, I don't know why I'm here? You know, do I fall into despair? Do I start not caring about anything that I do because there's no context and no container? Is there something that we can do to facilitate the meaningfulness of life here and now and the meaningfulness of death whenever it comes? Can we do something to somehow help create a narrative that accompany that? What kind of rituals can be useful? And that's part of the task that you have to engage with. And finally, how could we accompany ourselves and others through the cycle of life, death, and regeneration, something else. We know that there's going to be something else, just that we're not sure what. How can we be present, fully present, consciously present, in order to make this a central part of meaning that unfolds as we live on this earth? So I leave you with those thoughts, and I look forward to reading more of your reflections online, and thank you very much.